Hi, and welcome to the Virtual Hub. Today we're going to talk about how to build Microsoft Graph-driven applications for Microsoft Teams. This is a topic and area that I'm super interested and super passionate about. My name is Victor. I work as a Global Innovation Lead for Modern Workplace at Avanade. I've been recognized and awarded by Microsoft as an MVP and Regional Director within SharePoint and Office applications and services. If you have any follow-up questions after this session or during this session, you can reach me at the Victor handle on Twitter. That's the easiest way to get in contact. With this session, I want a couple of things for you. First of all, I want you to understand and know how to build a Microsoft Teams app that can seamlessly and securely connect and interact with Microsoft Graph. And to do that, we will have an in-depth walkthrough of all the necessary configuration and preparation you need to do, and all the different pieces of code that you need to stitch together. Microsoft Teams and Microsoft Graphs open up a great opportunity for us to build a lot of interesting applications. We can enrich our applications with the information from Microsoft Graph into the application to make the experience much better and combine that with your business-specific logic, etc. But there's a couple of caveats with this, and also a couple of problems that we need to think about and we need to be aware of. First of all, the Microsoft Teams app has no access to anything but itself. Essentially, the application lives inside Microsoft Teams within that Canvas and Chrome, but the application itself does not by default have access to Graph or any other resources. So, even though I said it lives inside Microsoft Teams, but that's sort of in an iframe. If you take a tab as an example, or a bot that's a web service hosted somewhere else. It does not live inside the Microsoft Teams application, more than visually. So, but the only thing Microsoft Teams by default can do is to help us to ensure the identity. And we do that through a configuration. So we know who the user is, so we can know that the user is authenticated when he or she accesses our application. With the help of Microsoft Azure AD and some more configuration, we can allow this application to contact Microsoft Graph or any other web API for that matter, and give and authorize the application to act on behalf of the user for that specific team or Graph in general. There's a couple of things we need to think about here. First of all, you might need to think about the consent. The first time a user uses your application, he or she might be presented with a consent dialog. How do you handle that? But the biggest problem is with Azure AD scopes. They are essentially all or nothing. So if we take an example where you need to update settings for a team, by default the only scope you have in Azure AD is group read write.all. That means that your application can read any team or group within your tenant, which is typically not what you want. And that's probably a hard way to get through security review and everything. But also, we have so many options of doing this. We can do it more easily. We can do it in more secure and less secure fashions, etc. And I highly recommend that you take a look at Bob German's presentation he did at the PMP virtual conference a couple of weeks ago. You have the link. I will give you the link at the end of the session, but that goes through all the kind of different options, the pros and cons of them. So that's a really good theory part if you want to understand that. For this session, however, we'll focus on what I think is the most easiest way and most secure and most seamless for the end user at least to get up and running with Microsoft Teams and that seamless sign on. So I will do this in 3 different steps. The first one is the configuration, how to set up and how to ensure the identity of the users. So in this case, we will use a tab, and that tab will use a JavaScript SDK to ensure that the user is who he or she says he is. And with the use of that identity, we can then let our application act on behalf of our user. So we can register our application in Azure AD. We can tell it that we wanted to be able to exchange that identity for an access token, which we can use to call into Graph. And we can do that. And we will actually show that in the demo to get the user profile picture, for instance. However, going back to that group.readWrite.all kind of scenario, that's not typically what we want to give to our Teams app. So we'll take a look at the resource-specific consent and how we can tell our application to only get permissions for that team that the application is installed into. For each of these scenarios, we will do the sort of theory behind it and how the actual authorization flow works in conjunction with your app, Microsoft Teams, and Azure AD. And we'll start with the first example where you want to ensure the identity of your user and use the Microsoft Teams tabs SSO flow. And how it works is that, first of all, you have your application, you created your tab, you have created the manifest, and I will show you how the code looks like in just a bit. The first thing you need to do is establish a trust between your tab and Azure AD, and that's done through an app registration. When your user opens up Teams and goes to your tab, he or she will open up that web page in that iframe inside the Microsoft Teams application, whether it be on web, mobile, or desktop. The tab will then call back using the JavaScript SDK and ask for the identity of the user. If this application isn't consented by either an admin or the user previously, you might get that consent pop-up or consent request back, and you need to implement that on your own. And I'll show you in the demo, code will actually contain some sample on how to do that. Once we've done that consent, we approve the application to act and give us identity and act on our behalf. The Microsoft Teams will call out Azure AD and request the identity token, and that identity token will be sent back to the Microsoft Teams application and then into your tab. Let's start with the first demo, where we configure and test our single sign-on tab and see how that works. So the first thing I need to do is go to Azure Active Directory and register my application. So I can do this in my developer tenant because I have permissions. If I need to do it in my corporate tenant, I need to either provide instructions to my tenant admins or provide them with scripts that sets the application up. But what I need to do is I need to go into app registrations. Then I need to click on new registration to create my specific registration of this application. And let's call it Teams Graph. I will choose accounts in any organization directory. That is, I will make it multi-tenant or directly. Then I click register. Once the application is registered, it will get an application ID. And this application ID is something that we need to persist and add to our configuration in our application. So I'm going to copy that application ID. And I already created and scaffolded out the Teams application. You can use Teams App Studio for this, or the VS Code and Visual Studio extensions for Teams, or as I do, I use the Geoman generated version of my Teams application. And in here, I already prepared a set of environment variables. And the first thing I need to do is paste in my ID of my application, so I can use that. And we'll see how that will be used in the manifest in just a bit. The next thing I need to do is to go into the app registration and click on Expose an API. In here, I need to set the application ID URI. If I click on Set here, you will see we get API : whack and then that GUID of the application ID. Very important step when you create that single sign-on experience for Microsoft Teams tabs is that they will do validation of your public URL. In my case, I'm using ngrok. So what I actually do is that I will take this API : whack and then my public available URL for my application and copy this into the app ID URI here. So I prefix my application ID with this. And this is how my app ID URI has to look like. So I copy that to the paste clipboard, click save. While that's being configured, I go over to my environment variable file again and paste it in here, so I have it saved for later. Okay, so now our app is up and running. The second thing we need to do in here, after setting that app ID URI, we need to add a scope. And this scope is used to show the identity of the user, so we can call this access as user. We need to do this both for admins and users, and you should provide a good consent display name, and both for the admins and users. So we just type this, copy paste a couple of times here for this demo. Then I click add scope. So I've done the application ID URI, I set the scope, and the third thing I need to do in here is to go and add some client applications. I need to add 2 client applications, and why do I need to do this? So yes, we need to consent the Teams application to be able to use this scope. So the first thing I'm going to do is copy paste the GUID of the Teams and mobile desktop. These are GUIDs, of course, you don't need to remember them. They are documented on the Teams development site. You will have the links at the end of the presentation. So add that client ID for the Teams and mobile and desktop client, and for this scope, and click Add Applications. As said, we have 2 applications. That's because the web application for Microsoft Teams is a separate application. So I'll go in and add that client application as well with this new GUID here, and I authorize that scope as well, and click Add Application. And with that, we should be fairly set to actually go into our Teams configuration. So I've done a couple of things here. This is mostly copy-paste. You need to know what you do. The important thing to remember here is that the URL has to match your URL of your application. There's one small thing that you need to be aware of. If you want to publish it on Azure and using Azure Web Apps, you cannot use azurewebsites.net, that domain name. It is actually considered insecure. So I'd recommend using Azure Front Door or similar, where you get a different URL, or buy your own domain name. Or as I do here, for development purposes, when I run this locally, I'm using ngrok to publish my application out. So if we jump over to my Visual Studio Code again, you see here I added the app ID and app URI in here. We'll come back to the secret in just a bit. Then I have my manifest file, and the key thing here, this is a Teams manifest file, and the key thing here is that this web application info that we have now. And for the Teams tab SSO, there's 2 things we need to have in here. It's the ID of the application and that app ID URI. It has to be here. And this is run through the build pipeline and actually being replaced with the real variables here. So let's go over and see, build this application, and let's install it to Microsoft Teams. To test our application, all we need to do is, of course, start the application so it runs locally, and you can see it's already running here on my local machine in the background in my Windows terminal. But I need to go to Microsoft Teams and upload it to the App Store. I can sideload it into Teams if I want to, but in this case we'll actually upload it to the corporate App Store, and I will choose the zip file of my application, and that's a manifest file which has those replaceable parameters replaced by the ID and app ID URI. I click on this one to upload it, and we will in a second see it coming up here in our App Store. And from now on I can add this to a team. So if I click on this one, and also can scroll down here and see that we actually now, it requests permissions to see my name, email address, etc. in here. If I click on Add to Teams, we choose the virtual hub team, click on Setup tab to start the configuration of our tab experience within that team. Once I get it into that team, we will get the configuration dialog for our application, which will load, and I can just enter dummy value in here. We're not using it for right now, but as soon as I click save, our tab is being set up and configured. And you could see that for a brief moment it said hello undefined actually, but now it says hello Victor, and that means it actually ensured the identity and received from Azure AD my real name. So as you can see, I registered the application, configured my Teams manifest, and then just installed the application. I haven't done anything else, no consent or anything here, so it's a fantastic seamless experience for the end user. So the interesting thing here is that if we take a look at what's actually happening behind the scene. If I go into my application, where I have this tab, and take a look at that JavaScript file or TypeScript file in this case, that actually requests this identity token so we know who the user is. So what I do here in my component, once I initialize the Microsoft Teams JavaScript SDK, receive the context, and done a couple of other things, I'll execute the Microsoft Teams.authentication get auth token. And this one has two callbacks essentially, one for success, one for failure that we have further bit down. If this is successful and the application is configured correctly, etc., I will get the token back. And this token is actually, when we're having Azure AD, it's a yaw token, so we can expand that and get out the username from this token. But this token I will use later to show you how to call back into our custom web APIs to exchange that identity token for an access token that can be used with Microsoft Graph. But let's take a look at how this token looks like. So the easiest way to do that is to open up the developer toolbar in our browser, and we go in and set the breakpoint just in our code here. Scroll down a bit. We go down to our embedded page container, which is our iframe with our application, and we expand into our React application into the tab and the first page here. And as you can see, here's the breakpoint right in that code. So if I reload this page again, here we will hopefully stop at this breakpoint and we can inspect that token. So here we are. Here we are in the code. We can actually see the token here. So if we go to the scope, we have the token here. Let's copy paste that one and go to OAuth.ms, which is my favorite token inspector for yaw tokens, and just remove these, and we'll see our token here. We can, which is what we did, that's the identity token that we have, and we can see the claims we have in here. So that's where I can get the name of the user, we can get the application ID, we can get the preferred username here, and a couple of other things that is probably not that interesting for us. But we should notice one thing. We can see that the scope that has been assigned to this identity token is the token that we created in Azure AD. So let's move on to the next part, where we take a look at how we can use this identity token exchange for an access token and start working with the Microsoft Graph. And just as with the previous example, let's take a look at how the flow works so you get an overall understanding of that. First of all, we have the Teams tab. We have also a custom API down here that we have implemented. So it's my web application and /API/photo. If I call into that, we should get the current user's photo. And how it works is that we first create our app registration. In this case, we actually need to add or inspect the scope of the application. We need to do an admin consent here as well, because it's a high privilege to do something on behalf of another. So the best way is to do that through an admin consent. I'll show you all of that. Then we pass our identity token to our API. We cannot use this directly, as I said, to call into Microsoft Graph. It doesn't have those scope and that audience. So what we need to do is that we need to call into Azure AD with the on behalf of flow with our identity token as assertion, and get back an access token that we can use for Microsoft Graph. We then can pass this access token to Microsoft Graph, and hopefully we will get the photo back, which we can send through our API into the tab and then display the photo. So let's take a look at how this works and how we register application and how the code looks like. In order to get the on behalf of flow to work, we need to go to Azure AD, and we need to first of all verify that we have the right permissions, that application has the right permissions to talk to Microsoft Graph. In this case, we are going to use to read the user's photo, and for that we only need user.read, which is the default scope you get when you create and register an application. But just go in there and verify that one. The second thing we need to do is that our application need to ensure that it's a valid application. So for that we need to create a secret for our application. So we'll go in here to certificates and secrets, and of course we can use a certificate if we want to, but for this demo let's use a secret. So I create a new one, and we call it Teams Graph API, and expire in 1 year. Click add. Then I get this new token or secret. I copy this one to the clipboard, and I'll actually go back into my application, my environment variables file, which I had, and paste this one, replace my old demo one here with this new secret. So that means that we will use a secret to do that exchange. And once I've done this, I actually need to restart my local machine. So we rebuild with that new secret. So we'll do that, and let's give it a minute to start up, and we can move over to Microsoft Teams and take a look at how the application looks like. But before we do that, I can do another thing. I need to do another thing in my graph application as well. I need just to uncomment this first piece of code here, which essentially will take my the current host name I have and call into my API photo, and I will pass in as a bearer token this identity token that we received in the previous example. And when I have that data, I'll read that data and then add that as an image into my application. So let's take a look at how this looks like when our application is built. Let's go into Microsoft Teams and reload our application and see how it looks like now once we did these changes and with our call to the photo API that we have in our application. As you can see, I get an error here that we actually need more permissions than we have right now. So to take a look at this, the easiest way is to actually take a look at the network here to see when we call into our API, and let's just filter for photo and let's reload it again, and you will see that my application is actually sending back an error. We need to go out of that debugger still, remove the breakpoint further, but go back to here and we'll see that we get an HTTP 400 bad request in this case. And so that with that I actually pop up this consent warning here. So this is due to I have not consented the application either as a user previously or as an admin. So we have two ways of doing this. We can first of all implement the consent flow here, and that means I need to go into Azure AD and first of all register a reply URL, which means that when I click on this one, consent to dialog, what am I redirected back to? And then I consent on a per user basis. Or I can go into Azure AD and actually go into API permissions and consent on the behalf of my organization. And I think that's something that's really valuable for you to do as an admin, because the experience for your end users is way easier. So I can just click grant admin consent for my whole tenant and click yes. And let's go back to our application and reload again. Hopefully we will see a nice profile picture coming up here in a second. There you have it. So now I get a decent 200 OK and my photo read from the Microsoft Graph. So how does this look like in the backend in my API then? If I go into my API, which is defined in here, the first router, which is reading the photo. First of all, I'm using Node.js as a backend here, and I'm using Passport to ensure that we have a valid identity token. So that's done through some configuration, which you will find. You can take a look at that in the GitHub repo that you will have linked to in the end of the session. The first thing that I do then is invoke a custom function that I call exchange for token, where I pass in the tenant ID, the current identity token, and the graph scopes that I want to have. And this exchange for token is using the OAuth on behalf of Flow, which takes it passes into the Azure AD V2 endpoint, the client ID, the secret that we created, the grant type that we need, the assertion, which is identity token, and I want to do this on behalf of, and finally, of course, the scopes. So I pass this in. I'm using raw OAuth here, so I'm passing into this. You should of course use SDKs, which make it much easier for you to handle all these kind of errors and issues, etc. Then I also send, depending on what kind of error I get, I send different errors back. So once I have this token, we can go back to our API, and then I just do this normal post, graph post, with this new access token that I received during this exchange, and just pass the data back. It's not harder than that. But the key thing here is that we need to do this exchange for token. And we can exchange it for any kind of token. If we add more scopes, we need to go in either to add that end user consent, or we go in and grant consent as an admin. So that's good. But going back to what I said in the beginning, what about the group read write.all? Can I do that? Yes, you can, but should you? So that's why the resource-specific consent has been implemented. Resource-specific consent essentially allows you to define for your application a set of scopes that are only scoped to that team that application is installed into. So instead of having your application having full access to the full graph and all groups and teams within, or all the settings for all the teams, we can scope that to only the team where the application is installed. So the application owner instead of the tenant owner can grant consent for all the users. And it's fairly similar as set up as previously, but what we need to add in here to the mix is that we need to add this team scope permission request, and that's defined in our manifest. The rest is fairly same. We need to do the same kind of trust as previously. We need to have create that secret. We will pass an identity token into our application. In this case, I want to read the settings of my team or write the settings. So for instance, you can allow the applications to update settings in your team without the members actually being an owner of that team. So I get the identity token, pass it in to Azure AD using the client credentials flow, get an access token back, pass that into that graph endpoint for that specific graph group ID in this case, and get the data back, which I can pass to my application. So the flow is very similar. The difference is how you register these applications. So let's take a look at how that looks like in practice. So I'll go back into my application and let's uncomment the last piece of the code here, where I actually will read my API settings like that. So you see here I'm calling into my API/settings. I'm passing in the same token, but also passing in the current group ID, which I received from the Teams context using the Teams JavaScript SDK. Before we do that, we can actually take a look at the previous JAW token that we received when we took that photo, just to have it as a comparison. So I'm just logging out here the token that the access token that we received when exchanging that one, and let's paste it into jaw.ms again, like this. And you can see here, scroll up, paste in that one. You can see the claims we have in here. In this case, the audience was for the graph, and we can see that we have scopes down here, which is, here's the scope. So user read, which is required to read that profile photo, and then we have the OpenID and email. So if we go back to our application, and hopefully it's built, our application is now built, so that we can go over to the tab again and just let's reload it. So if we reload the application, we can now see that we have the picture, we get my name, but we also get GIFs are allowed, and that's part of what we retrieve from the setting. So you can see here is my call to that API. So API/settings and then the group ID, and what I receive back is all the settings, in this case the fund settings. So if I go in and modify the settings for my team, we can go in here, edit team, we go into manage team, into settings, and turn off the fund settings, which is the GIFs. So we disable them, and then go back to our tabs, to our tab here, and take a look at that one, and we will see that they are now turned off. So that's all done through this new scoped resource-specific scope, so they are not allowed. So I'm reading those settings, and this could be done by anyone who's a member of this team. We can even do write updates here, but I cannot use this JAW token to access any other groups in this case. So if we quickly take a look at the code, it's very similar to the previous one. So in my router, I have another endpoint which points to the settings with the group ID. But instead of using the on behalf of flow, I use the client credentials flow. So I get the app token for this one. And what you should be thinking about here is I'm passing in the same graph scopes here. But the key thing here is when we register our application, we had in our manifest JSON application permissions. So when I actually register the application, there's things happening behind the scene in Azure AD which you can't see. So we're actually registering specific permissions here on team settings, read.group, and that's read write group, and for different kind of settings which are documented in the SDK as well. But this is a key to everything, and this is almost the only place you can see this on. So as I said, we did this registration. We can go back to the App Store here, and you will actually see it in the permissions request as well, which I skipped past when we did the initial install. Let's go into Teams Graph, and we scroll down here. We actually have read this team settings. So how does Azure AD know about this? So first of all, let's take a look at that new access token that we received during our second request, and you will see something peculiar. If we go paste that one into jot.ms and paste it in here, and we scroll down, and in this case it's not the user credentials, app credentials. We get a role, and here's something, a weird scope which is called group selected, and this is what we get from Azure AD when we have these resource specific consents. So if I go back to my application, there's no other scopes here than user.read. So these are all happening behind the scenes. So essentially there's only one way for you to find out, unless you have the application installed, of course, but from an admin point of view, there's no, it's hard for you to know where you actually where you have those permissions. So what you can do is you can use Graph Explorer or Graph API to call into that. So if I go to the beta endpoint, I go to Teams, and we go to get the group ID, and we should have that in the URL somewhere. It's up here. That's the group ID, and let's copy that one, paste it in here, and then we have the endpoint called permission grants. Sorry, should be groups. And that's the way we can find out what kind of permissions do we have. So we can see, we can scan through all the groups that we have and get permission grants for all these, and get the, in this case we can see team settings, read.group, that's our permission. So that's the way we find that out. So that's it. Now you've seen how to create a Teams tab in this case with that seamless single sign-on, without us having to pass any access tokens over between our single page application, our tab in this case, and our APIs, but we're using that identity token only. We've seen how we can use that to get an access token on behalf of the user and pass into Microsoft Graph. And finally, we saw how to use resource-specific consent to get permissions for members and owners for a specific team only. So all of this is detailed in the Microsoft Teams Developer Center as well, and you can find all the RSC scopes in there if you want to. I use the OTeams generator to create my Teams application in here. As I mentioned previously, you should look into Bob German's PnP Virtual Conference session about some of the theories and alternatives and options you have to this. I do have written a blog post about the on behalf of if you want some more details, and you can find all the demo code at this GitHub URL. Thanks for listening, and until next time.